so important to keep the atrocity of the Uyghurs in the news and to keep the awareness alive. It's so essential because really we're still facing significant issues in the region, in particular in the area of forced labor. I'll be speaking today on the topic of forced labor in particular, and I'm going to be sharing my screen. There we go. So, an assessment of the current situation on forced labor that we are seeing in the Uyghur homeland. I'll be speaking today firstly on forced labor and what it is and how it works, on findings on forced labor in Xinjiang's agricultural production, some implications of the updated ILO measurement guidelines on the measurement of forced labor, and what must be done to address the situation in the Uyghur homeland. Firstly, it is very significant to understand that Xinjiang has two systems of forced labor that are working in tandem. The first system is linked to the campaign of mass internment. This campaign formally concluded at the end of 2019, although we are seeing ongoing waves of detention. Many detainees were shifted either to prisons and assigned long prison terms and remained disappeared, or they were sent to forced labor settings, placed into low-skilled labor-intensive manufacturing. We assess that while this system of forced labor is likely to continue in some form, it no longer actively processes victims. In short, the active system of forced labor that we're seeing is the second system, the labor transfer program, where so-called rural surplus laborers are coercively trained and transferred to work outside of agricultural in a wide range of low-skilled labor-intensive manufacturing. And that includes agricultural harvesting. These two systems are unequal in size. We estimate that at least several 100,000 likely were shifted from camps into forced labor settings, whereas the poverty elevation through a labor transfer system places the vast majority in that system at risk of forced labor. This system is increasing and intensifying in scale. We have seen a leadership shift from Chen Xuanguo, who oversaw the campaign of mass internment and other policies, to a new party secretary, Ma Xingrui, a bureaucrat from Eastern China, who is overseeing a normalization and institutionalization of many government policies, including the system of forced labor transfers. At the moment, we are seeing a strong focus on preventing people from returning to poverty in case the measurable income declines. There's an unemployment monitoring early warning system, and in many ways this functions as a system of labor retention. This means that Uyghurs are unable to return to their original livelihoods. Government statistics indicate an increase of the numbers of labor transfers. These numbers are displayed in million person times. And they also include some Han Chinese, although about 85% of labor transfers affect ethnic groups. The recent intensification can be accounted for by increased work requirements that we're seeing, such as in the 14th five-year plan on employment promotion implemented in Xinjiang starting in 2021 until 2025. Now, there are several reasons why Uyghur forced labor is becoming more prevalent as we speak. We can assess a significant increase in rural workers transferred to other Chinese provinces after the end of COVID, even though region-wide figures have not been published. We see dedicated additional efforts in Uyghur regions to promote full employment, such as the Southern Xinjiang Employment Promotion Project. And of course, these policies really transform rural livelihoods, organic ethnic communities. They're part of an effort to thoroughly transform and dismantle these organic communities. There's a strong focus on full employment of so-called populations who have been alleviated from poverty after 2020. which marked the official end of the campaign to abolish absolute poverty, which the Chinese state claims has been achieved. So now there are about 1.1 million persons in Xinjiang designated as so-called poverty alleviated individuals who are subject to special monitoring, lest they might sort of return to a state of poverty. And this subjects them to interstate control.
Just to, apologies for interrupting. The slides are frozen. Could you reopen the slideshow? We're just getting messages in that it's only showing the first slide.
Oh, I see. Oh, I'm very sorry. Yeah, thanks for saying that. How about now? Can you see the slide with the statistics?
Yeah. Could we full screen the slides possibly?
Let's see. We might be able to do that. Like this.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. That means that the presentation mode wasn't working. Okay. So next slide here. There is a paranoia about risk. Xi Jinping had an unannounced visit to Xinjiang in August 2023, where he gave the first direct public affirmation of the primacy of stability against the command of mass internment. I apologize for the error on the second bullet point, which is supposed to say that Xi explicitly emphasized that the organized transfers of workers, of rural surplus laborers from Xinjiang to eastern China was to be continued, as it was a way to promote ethnic fusion and the ethnic assimilation of Uyghurs into the Han Chinese majority society. We also see a significant increases of foreign trade of Xinjiang, of course, after the end of the campaign of mass internment and the most intense period of securitization, during which trade and flows of goods declined, were inhibited because of the extreme securitization measures. We now see an increase, a rapid increase, in fact, particularly with goods going to Vietnam, going to Southeast Asia, going to Central Asia, and also going to Europe quite directly through the Belt and Road train routes. And on the lower part, we see that the southern Xinjiang share of all foreign trade is increasing. It increased quite rapidly from 22% in 2021 to 31% for the first 9 months of 23. This is due to the intensification of factory work in southern Xinjiang, focused on the Uyghur heartlands, which is production for export. Now, just at the end of last year, we published a new report focused on forced labor transfers for agricultural production. And just briefly, this report showed labor transfers and other state policies, including the transfer of land, focused on the production of tomatoes, peppers, and derivatives. Peppers are also used as pigments and cosmetics, for example. Marigold, which, for example, is an ingredient in a natural colorant and antioxidant pigment. And stevia, a natural sweetener that's increasingly popular. The report implicates in particular 4 major Chinese state-owned corporations, representing over 50% of China's tomato production and 2/3 of the world's production of red pepper pigment. XPCC and state-owned companies include COFCO, Guangdong, Chongguang, and Chalkis. Xinjiang does produce a very large share also of the world's, not just of the world's tomato paste, which is 14 to 15%, but also 10% of chili peppers and nearly 2/3 of, for example, paprika oleoresin, which is a pigment used in food coloring and cosmetics. So this goes beyond food. It goes into cosmetics, into food supplements and products such as that. Now, there are 5 risks of rights abuses linked to Xinjiang's agricultural production. Firstly, forced agricultural production, where farmers cannot choose what they produce. They have to produce what the state mandates. Secondly, the coerced transfer of land use rights. That's basically land grabbing. Theoretically, the state claims that land use rights can be claimed back. But de facto, it's not possible, because what happens is that the government is creating large contiguous areas of farmland for efficient mechanized agriculture and industrialized agriculture and upscaled agricultural production. And for that purpose, even government reports admit that farmers cannot say, I want to retain my land, and then there's one little plot of land in a big field that cannot be farmed by the Chinese agribusiness. The third is forced labor, and the fourth is the use of re-education camp detainee labor, which is outlined in the report. And then fifth, we have the situation where these major Chinese producers themselves are directly participating in the enforcement of coercive state policies through door-to-door visits and so on, including the operation of their own militia as part of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, a paramilitary entity in the region. And this phenomenon of land grabbing, which is linked to forced labor, is accelerating quite dramatically, as you can see in the statistics. The percentage now even exceeds that of the rest of the country, the national average, with land transfer shares increasing about 50-fold in the last 20 years. And basically what we're seeing is that the land of Uyghur farmers is given to major big Chinese agribusinesses. The farmers no longer can work as farmers, their livelihood changes, so they are then quote-unquote liberated, the government calls it, to work often for these very same agribusinesses. They may even be working the same land that they worked before, but in a different way and without the freedom to choose what they're doing. The focus here is on value-added processing, on vertically integrating supply chains, often for export purposes. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Xinjiang's exports have been increasing significantly. This results in significant connections and tainting of supply chains. We implicate a total of nearly 90 companies with direct or indirect links to Xinjiang or production in Xinjiang itself. And in particular, I want to highlight a very direct collaboration between Kraft Heinz and Costco. Kraft in China uses tomatoes from Xinjiang for their products in China, in Russia, in Central Asia, in one or two other countries. And they have an active collaboration with COFCO, a Chinese state-owned enterprise that's implicated in several aspects of genocidal actions, including birth prevention policies as a state-owned company. They have a joint seed development product and other collaborations, which is very problematic. Now, one of the challenges has been to assess and to understand and to capture forced labor. And this, in fact, has produced challenges for the work of the International Labour Organization in Geneva. The reason is that state-imposed forced labor is much harder to measure. Typically, corporate audits focus on worker management at the workplace, which is the little gray circle on the right hand. But labor transfers in Xinjiang, but also other systems of state-imposed forced labor that are not directly based on camps or prisons, form a dynamic system of non-internal forced labor mobilization, starting from state policy, identifying target populations, coercive recruitment, skills training, transfer, and then retention. And this is predicated on a systemically coercive social environment and a police state where there is no free civil society. So this grassroots mobilization part is really where much of the coercive aspect takes place. And this is where measurement in theory would need to take place, which of course is very difficult. So much of the assessment of forced labor for these labor transfers would have to take place outside workplaces. State-imposed forced labor is dynamic, it's not static, and it is endemic because it's everywhere. It's not easily measured in one given place. This poses unique challenges. I wrote a research article displayed here on the right-hand side in 2023 assessing the shortcomings of the International Labour Organization's measurement guidelines. and I interviewed several senior ILO officials for this research. This prompted some rethinking and reconceptualization at the ILO. And I'm very grateful that they then adapted their measurement guidelines, which they had planned to do anyways. So the new guidelines of the ILO, the new handbook on forced labor surveys, specifically mentions labor transfer schemes targeting ethnic minorities for relocation and classifies them as a form of state-imposed forced labor. Several of my concepts were adopted in the work, for example, the concept of non-determined state-imposed forced labor mobilization that is best measured or assessed during the mobilization phase and is more readily assessed as a general systemic risk rather than a specific instance. It's very hard to measure specific instances of forced labor. The reason for that is that, as the ILO now points out, and this is a point they took from my work, that this form of forced labor creates an environment that renders victims much less likely to speak freely. Further adopted is the fact that the evidence for state-imposed forced labor can be assessed through an active state policy. And the report presents many improvements that can inform national policy making and lead to improved corporate behavior. However, at the multilateral level in Geneva, of course, we see a lot of impact of Beijing's transnational repression and other influence operations. Recently, you may have seen the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, with a major China targets investigation. And I happen to know that the ILO asks for a tripartite mission, meaning an evaluation mission, but to Xinjiang, but Beijing is not agreeing to that, arguing that what is taking place in Xinjiang is simply poverty alleviation. Unfortunately, China was also able to influence one of the three groups that make up the ILO, the employers. The employers have refused to select China as a forced labor case. This was in 2025. No, I'm sorry, in 2023, I think. And that means that China will not be examined now, will not come under scrutiny until around the middle of 2026, when there's another chance to select it. But again, if the employers again refuse to select China, then it's very difficult to hold China accountable in the ILO context, despite the fact that there's clear evidence that China runs the largest system of state-imposed forced labor in the world. China further uses threats of dividing or sabotaging entities such as the ILO, using a sort of geopolitical strategies to play on fears of the system of becoming dysfunctional. And this is very effective because these UN entities are they are very focused on self-preservation. So if a major power threatens to dismantle them or to sabotage them, they very quickly go into a mode where they will do anything to preserve the functioning of their system, even if they're not doing their job. And this is the manifest risk we are looking at here at the ILO level. It is important to understand that forced labor is part of a wider genocidal system. So forced labor is not just operating in isolation, but of course, it facilitates the separation of families, of husbands and wives. It facilitates the separations of parents and children. Of course, we have in operation a very large boarding school system. The most recent figures we have on that system is that 880,000 children were placed into boarding schools. That's data from 2019. This does not include preschooling, the preschool initiative, with then at least one or two family members being subjected to labor transfers. We also see, and we've had evidence from an internal Chinese academic reports, the so-called Nankai report, that labor transfers are part of optimizing the ethnic population structure, which is one of the goals of the Chinese state, meaning reduce the density of the Uyghur population in their own homeland through labor transfer, through birth prevention, and additionally through large-scale programs to increase Han Chinese settlers moving into these regions. This is particularly problematic. strategy that is genocidal or carries the risks of being genocidal in terms of the population dynamics. We also have labor transfers enabling increased birth control because Chinese companies who receive these laborers implement state policies, including birth prevention policies among the women that they receive. And of course, in these work settings, Uyghur laborers and other ethnic laborers are subject to much more stringent controls. Speaking of which, these workplaces also facilitate, as Xi Jinping himself said in so many words, forms of cultural assimilation, with workers having to speak Chinese and not being able to practice their religion. In conclusion, what must be done? Much must be done. Firstly, I think it's important to say that despite a reduced police presence and despite the transformation of the campaign of mass internment into a longer-term mode, we are assessing that severe forms of repression persist in Xinjiang, even if they're less visible at times. These include a backgrounded police state with plainclothes police. These include continued imprisonment. These these include continued forms of detentions that we have reports, particularly in early 2023, after the white paper demonstrations against severe COVID measures in Urumqi in December 2022, following a fire that killed many Uyghurs who could not escape their homes. Governments need to act on implementing a robust import ban on goods produced or linked to Uyghur forced labor. The European Union approved such a step in 2024 and has a 3-year time frame to implement it by 2027. Using a database format, the United States keeps working on its UFLPA and its enforcement by the Department of Homeland Security and CBP. And I do understand that there's constant adaptation, but it's very much a cat and mouse game. It's very much, and we found this actually with our investigation into tomatoes, that a lot of the supply chain data is lacking. And you may have seen the most recent reporting by the New York Times and the Spiegel, the German Spiegel, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London, analyzing thousands of Chinese social media videos and identifying labor transfers of Uyghurs to at least 75 factories in 11 Chinese provinces, implicating many, many brands. And I know that the journalists also visited these factories and got information about some of the work conditions, got information that Uyghurs were there, even about the work hours of Uyghurs, which can be very long. I think there's much scope for leveraging the updated ILO guidelines for the measurement of forced labor, to adopt them and leverage them. I know that the text of the legislation of the European Union contains references to ILO guidelines and standards. And so hopefully that is going to really facilitate the European Union's adoption of their upcoming forced labor regulation. We need strong increase of awareness among politicians, corporations, and consumers. This is a very important step. Here is just an overview of some of the articles that I and my team have been working on and publishing in the last years on Uyghur forced labor, including the audit of the Volkswagen's controversial factory in Xinjiang that they're now trying to divest from, the continuation of labor transfers, the new unemployment monitoring early warning system, the agricultural production, and many other measures. And of course, many other scholars have put out work on supply chains linked to Uyghur forced labor that extend to seafood, extend to cotton, textiles, batteries, aluminum, car parts. And I think the most recent investigation that was published indicates also the number of sectors in China generally that are implicated. Now, for sectors where Xinjiang has a very high share of production, within China domestically, such as tomatoes, such as cotton, to some extent polysilicon, it really becomes very problematic in terms of companies remaining in China and continuing to source from China. And that, I think, is very significant for our understanding. How can companies, Western companies, continue to source from China when such a high share, there's such a high risk that there's a connection to Uyghur forced labor, a system that, as we can tell, continues to expand, not only within the Uyghur homeland, but also across other Chinese provinces. Thank you.